scenario. We could get into the acid rain subject and simply say that the federal government spent 10 years studying it, and after 10 years, all during the 1980s, published a report that said, yes, indeed, there are some acid lakes and streams, but they were always acidic, and it is not caused by any of man's activities. But they, again, don't want to point to this. They don't want to point to the facts. They want very much to have you and me give up our freedom, give up our sovereignty, stop using our automobiles, cut back on industrial activity here in our country, and even give up our sovereignty. And they always come forward with the United Nations as the solution. Well, scary scenario after scary scenario, there has to be a reason for them. Why are they doing it? So let's get away from the science of the environmental business and let's get into the politics about it. I like to say, if you think we've been politically incorrect up until now, fasten your seatbelts. Now we intend to get more so. Very simply, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that some men want to rule the world, and now some women as well. They don't want free people. They don't want sovereign nations. They don't want anything other than their rule over everyone and everything. And they are willing to conspire behind the scenes in order to bring about that goal of rule by them. The individuals involved in this ambitious undertaking previously financed the creation of communism. They supplied it, they built it, they scared the world with it, always suggesting that the answer to the scare of communism was world government run by them. And now they have largely abandoned that. And I don't say totally, because communism still exists in China and in Cuba and in several other places. And it could come back. But communism was the scare previously to force us into world government, and now it's environmentalism. They haven't abandoned the goal of communism. They could return to it, but so far they haven't. Now I say that these same individuals and those who came before them, who come out of organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. I study the Council on Foreign Relations quite well, as best I can, and here's the annual report of that organization, 1991. It contains the membership list in the back. You find 382 U.S. government officials. You find top officials of the media. You find top officials in the corporate world, in the military, in the clergy, and so forth. Only 2,600 of them, and yet it reads like a who's who in America. We also study the Trilateral Commission, and we read their publications as well, and we come up with their membership list. There's less than 100 from our country in the Trilateral Commission and only 300 total, and yet they are very potent individuals as well. There are United States senators and former government officials and some officials of the U.S. Senate and so forth. It's a very, very prominent group of individuals, and they're all promoting these same goals. Now I'd like to recommend at this point a wonderful book on the subject of the Council on Foreign Relations called The Shadows of Power. And this is the history of this organization from its inception in 1921. I could not recommend it more highly. It does give you a whole new perspective on history and the people who make it. And so we recommend that highly. Now let me try to demonstrate to you. I said before that some of these people financed the creation of communism. They supplied it, they built it, they scared the world with it. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a conspiracy that predates our time and goes back even more than 100 years. People who weren't communists financed Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto. People who weren't communists financed Lenin and Trotsky to take control of Russia. And our government, led by people who weren't communists, continued to supply them and keep them in business all during much of the 20th century. After World War II, we gave them airborne communications parts and radar and tire cord factories and chemical plants and machine tools and the money to purchase them, and then we canceled the debt. And all this time, the American people are being told that they have the bomb and we have the bomb, and therefore we should be afraid and we should give up our sovereignty to a super agency that could control everybody and keep us from being incinerated in a nuclear war. And that's what was working against us. But the American people didn't buy it. Certainly some of them did. And the ones who didn't stuck to their guns, so much so that the individuals who were promoting these theories and these theses made a switch. They switched to a new kind of scare. Now let me show you something here. This is quite dramatic. This is a photocopy of a government document, and the title of it is A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. As you can see, the author is Lincoln P. Bloomfield, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This was put together in 1962, and it was paid for by you and me with our tax dollars. Now, Dr. Bloomfield, there are many amazing revelations in this. It was originally classified, but then it was declassified or unclassified, and we got a copy of it. And I just want to read to you one little sentence out of it. In fact, it's not even a whole sentence. It's a half a sentence. And it explains why they were financing communism. What he said was this: if the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might lose whatever incentive it has for world government. Let me repeat that. If the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might lose whatever incentive it has for world government. That says it all. That's why they kept communism in business. That's why they built it into a giant world power. That's why they helped it to get the atomic weapons, which they certainly did, in order to scare you and me and the rest of our fellow Americans and the entire West into wanting world government. Happily, it didn't take. And so the first try at world government began after World War I with the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was something that the United States Senate debated for 9 months and voted 56 to 37 against. We did not enter the League of Nations. And the men from our country who were very anxious that we get involved in the League of Nations, this world government that would dominate everybody in the hands of a very few, they were very anxious to promote this concept, and they were very disappointed when they heard that the U.S. Senate had failed to ratify America's entry into it in 1919. And the men who were behind it were led by Edward Mandell House, one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, President Wilson's chief advisor. And he and his young friends, his diplomatic associates, were in Paris at the time. And amongst them were John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles and Christian Herter and Sumner Wells and Walter Lippmann and others. And they helped to form the Council on Foreign Relations. They got together with their British emissaries and they met in May of 1919 in the Majestic Hotel in Paris. And out of that meeting, the British formed the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Americans formed the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations has been working since 1921 to persuade the American people of the need for world government. Scrap the Declaration of Independence, scrap or alter the Constitution of the United States, and bring us into a world federation. That's what they wanted. And so they began to work as far back as 1921 to accomplish that. Excuse me. In 1973, some of these same individuals formed the Trilateral Commission, which is a newer organization and has the very same goal. The Council on Foreign Relations can be said to be working mostly in political subject matter, the Trilateral Commission working mostly in economic matters that are of interest to the people. Not that they are exclusively in one or the other, they certainly do cross over, but one focuses on the political situation, the other focuses on the economics. Now remember, Bloomfield said that they needed something to scare the American people into wanting world government. And so at the end of World War II, the second try for world government, the United States Senate debated entry into the United Nations, which these people had been very instrumental in correcting. There were 40-some-odd members of the Council on Foreign Relations who had a hand in the construction of the United Nations. And there were at least 17 known communists who also had a hand in it. The second try, the U.S. Senate debated it for only 6 days. And they voted 90-2 in favor of our entry into the United Nations. And they want to scare the American people into it. And so we had the tremendous fright of a nuclear war all the time. The Soviets had the bomb and we had the bomb. And if we didn't have some sort of an umbrella agency controlling all of this and going across borders, then we're all going to end up being incinerated and become a nuclear ash pile. Well, it didn't take, as I said, but as far back as 20 years ago, they began to promote a possible alternative to a nuclear war as the technique or as the tactic to use to scare the people into wanting world government. In 1972, the organization called the World Association of World Federalists published an article. This is 20 years ago as we're making this program. And here's what it said. World Federalists believe that the environmental crisis facing planet Earth is a global problem and therefore calls for a global solution. There you go. A global problem, a global solution. They began to promote the idea of an environmental scare as far back as 1972. In 1972, a man named Lester Brown also came out with the very same scenario. He promoted the use of the environmental scare as well. Lester Brown, the head of the organization World Watch Institute and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. What did Lester Brown say? Well, in 1972 he wrote a book called World Without Borders, and in it he proposed, quote, a world environmental agency that was needed, quote, to arrest the deterioration of the environment, which does not seem to be possible within the existing framework of independent nation states. And there it is, all summed up in one thing. Can't solve the environmental problems with the independent nation states. In 1991, this same Lester Brown came out with an article entitled State of the World 1991, and he said again, the battle to save the planet will replace the battle over ideology as the organizing theme of the New World Order. Now, we've all heard that term, New World Order. We've heard President Bush use it. It actually has been the slogan of a conspiracy for many generations. Did President Bush know that when he was using the phrase? It's a little hard to say, and it's a little hard to suspect that he didn't. Now we're talking 1972 here. Here are people beginning to suggest that we should use the environmental fright instead of the world bomb or the world nuclear holocaust fright in order to scare people. In 1974, one of the Council on Foreign Relations policy setters, a man who I've been watching for a long time, he wrote an article for their magazine. It's called Foreign Affairs. And this is, as you see, in 1974. And the title of the article by Richard Gardner is The Hard Road to World Order. What did he say in that article? He said that he was anxious to see performed, quote, an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. Incredible. That, to me, that attitude is abject treason. That man had been a State Department official. He'd been an ambassador representing our country in a European nation. He's been in and out of government. He's a professor at Columbia University in New York City, and he's an ardent internationalist. He does not like national sovereignty. So what did he say in this article that's germane to what we're talking about here today? Did he bring up the environmental problem, so-called, as a possible substitute? Yes, he did. He said this: the next few years should see a continued strengthening of the new global and regional agencies charged with protecting the world's environment. In addition to comprehensive monitoring of the Earth's air, water, and soil, and of the effects of pollutants on human health, we can look forward to new procedures, probably including some kind of international environmental impact statement. Well, if you're a businessman and you have to fill out an impact statement to satisfy some county officials, or you want to try and build a home and you have to do it for this group or this government agency, maybe even at citywide or statewide, and sometimes even federal impact statements, just imagine what it will be like if you have to also go and form an environmental statement put out by the United Nations. And so we see for many, many years these people have been suggesting as an alternative to the scare of war using the environmental scares. Now in 1991, the Trilateral Commission